Hi, good morning, good afternoon. So we're going to start. So please everybody have a seat. Great. So welcome to this this final event, almost final event before the closing of the session with the International Commission of Experts on Financing for Development. I'll wait for you all to sit. So. No, it's okay. Please come in, everybody. Come, let's sit. Let's get started. Thank you all for sticking with us all for a lot of events today and a lot of panels, and I hope you found them as interesting and as stimulating as I did the ones I was able to attend. So we're at the final, the end stretch of this and of this day, the academic day. And we're starting with a session on the International Commission of Experts on Financing for Development. So the commission is a group of independent experts that were convened by the host country of FFD4, Spain, to prepare a comprehensive report to enrich the preparatory process of FFD4. It has 14 members in total and is chaired by Professor Jose Antonio Ocampo, who is here today with us. And I think that the past conferences on FFD, starting with Monterrey and also in Addis Ababa, have shown the value of having an independent report that can help identify key issues, propose innovative approaches, and suggest actionable recommendations that can be used as one of the inputs for member states to consider as they move forward in looking for solutions to today's really big financing challenges. The Commission has commenced its work in September and has already held two discussions? Yeah, two discussions already. So I'm really excited to have Jose Antonio with us today and several of the Commission members who are going to join virtually. As I think most of you know me, if you don't, I'm Sherry Spiegel. I'm the Director of the Financing for Sustainable Development Office in UNDP, and I'll be moderating today's event. And so I really think this is an excellent way to round off today's discussion, and I'm going to pass the floor to Professor Ocampo, who's from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, but also, most of you know, was the Minister of Finance in Columbia, but also the Minister of Transportation. Agriculture. So, okay, also the Minister of Agriculture. So lots and lots of experience, and it was previously also the Undersecretary General in DESA, so before I came, but maybe is one, yeah. So I'm going to ask you, please, to provide an update on the work of the Commission, give insights about areas and challenges that you've been focusing on, and some of the recommendations. I know it's early in the process, but some of the recommendations and ideas that might be emerging from your work.
Well, thank you, Shari. So let me start by outlining the 8 areas that we have chosen for our work, which actually builds on the Addis Ababa action plan, although with at least 2 more areas that were not in that action plan. I'm going to be very brief on the different topics. Some of the other colleagues from the Commission, from a group of experts, will probably express complementary issues. The first one is development financing, which will have ODA, but also the role of multilateral development banks and how they can be expanded significantly, and how the connections with national financing, which means national development banks on the one hand, but also the development of bond markets in developing countries, which are very important also to reduce the risk associated to to variations in the exchange rates, which is a major problem with debt for many developing countries. The second is financing environmental sustainability, which is climate change, but also biodiversity. And in that regard, of course, the role of multilateral development banks will be underscored, but also, and very importantly, how to promote private financing, private investment in those areas, which could be with lending by the multilateral development banks, but also the active use of guarantees by the development banks, in a sense expanding the sort of mechanism that the World Bank in particular has been developing and could be replicated by the regional development banks, among others. And of course, the special funds. But let me say, in the case of the special funds, and this is very important for low-income countries, I guess the recent conference of the parties on climate change was very frustrating because the amount of resources that were approved were significantly lower than what the developing countries expected. Anyway, so that's an area which I think the UN should continue to emphasize the importance of more financing. The third issue is strengthening the global safety net. In that regard, that's the global monetary system. I guess the most important issue that we're going to underscore is a more active use of special drawing rights of the IMF, which means more regular issues of special drawing rights and more active use of special drawing rights, with a particular proposal to eliminate the dual accounting in the IMF, which is one of the major reasons why the SDRs are just accounting in the IMF rather than anything else. So if the dual accounting is eliminated, which is a proposal, going back to the 1970s, actually, when they were created, will be they will consider that deposits of countries in the IMF, which means that the IMF will have significantly more resources that could be allocated for different purposes if the countries themselves could start using them to deposit, for example, in funds that provide the financing for different purposes. For example, funds in the multilateral development banks or independent funds which can provide different forms of financing. We are also going to propose that the IMF should be able to intervene in the bond markets, in the international bond market for emerging and developing countries, which are very pro-cyclical, so as to particularly to allow them to allow the IMF to intervene during periods of crisis in order to moderate the increases in the risk margins and the reductions in financing that takes place during those periods. In a sense, it's a similar mechanism to that which the Fed does in the U.S. With the bond markets of the U.S. or the European Central Bank has done with in Europe. So this is a mechanism to intervene in the bond markets of developing countries. The fourth issue is sovereign debt crisis resolution, which is, if I may say, probably the most critical issue now, on which the actions have been extremely limited. And in that regard, there are two types of proposals. One for managing the short-term crisis of about a third of developing countries which are over-indebted. And the second is to have a more regular mechanism where the decisions of sovereign debt restructuring are negotiated, which could be in the United Nations or could be in the IMF, so long as in the IMF the decisions of the appropriate the body are totally independent from the board of the IMF. So it will be an independent body that manages crisis, debt restructuring, which is hosted by the IMF, but is not dependent on the decisions of the governing bodies of the IMF. Some issues of financial regulation. This is a topic which we have added on top of the issues that were already done in Monterrey. And there are several critical issues that we wanted to to discuss. One is the regulation of the crypto assets. The crypto assets should be considered a financial asset, and therefore have the same features that regulate financial assets, which means protection of depositors, or persons who buy the assets, which today there is none for those crypto assets, and also avoiding the use of those crypto markets for illegal transactions, which is a major problem both for, let's say, money from corruption, but also money from narco trafficking that is done through those markets. This is something that is done through the financial system, but it's not there. And the other is the managing of commodity commodity futures and commodity market financing, which is a major issue because the experience indicates that during periods of booms of price increases, most of the benefits go to a few companies. So how to manage those markets, and also to have some sort of interventions in the commodity markets, which could be a link between national, regional, or national interventions to stabilize the prices of the commodity prices, which, by the way, could be virtual interventions, not only effective interventions with the accumulation of stocks. And in international tax cooperation, the sixth issue, we're going to basically endorse the UN process to have a convention on international tax cooperation. In that regard, we're going to make several proposals of what that it should include in order to manage some of the most important issues. The most important issues being how to guarantee a fair taxation or a fair contribution to taxation by the very rich individuals, and the other is equitable payment of taxes by multinational corporations in all the countries where they operate, including, by the way, in those that they sell virtually, for example, movies or TV programs, that the country where the consumption is done receives no tax benefit from those activities. So that how to the concept of significant economic presence, which was promoted by the group of developing countries, the group of 24, the group of developing countries in the Bretton Woods institution, in the OECD negotiation, but was not accepted. We're going to include that principle as one of our recommendations. The seventh issue is issues of trade and investment, in which, in the case of investment, we want to propose a revision of the international investment regulations in order to avoid the demands on countries when they intervene for social and environmental issues, the activities of multinationals, so as to avoid the cases in which an international firm in a particular developing country does, for example, environmental damage, is the country establish a penalty to that corporation can demand the country and win the demand internationally. So how to avoid those cases in the case of trade, we're really going we're taking trade at WTO because of intellectual property rights are in the hands of WTO. So our recommendation is actually to guarantee that access to medical goods, but particularly for all environmental technologies, do not have to pay any royalties. So in the sense, should be freely available to whoever produces. By the way, the issue this issue does relate to the environmental sustainability. So that environmental sustainability, aside from financing, we're going to recommend some principles also in financial regulation, so that all countries include the risk of lending that could lead to environmental damage of some sort, to include that in the financial regulations of countries, and in this case, the intellectual property rights. And finally, some critical institutional issues, which I would say are basically three types of issues. The first one is the issue of voice and participation of developing countries in the Bretton Woods institution, which means capital contribution that take into account the size of developing countries today, but also the inclusion of basic votes to a larger proportion that we have today. In fact, in the Bretton Woods institutions, the basic votes are today about, even after the increase that they were subject in 2008, 2010, are only about half of what they were when they were approved at Bretton Woods. So this is a very important issue for small and poor countries that basically depend on the basic votes to have a vote. And also to have the open competition for the heads of those the jobs of heads of those institutions, so that any citizen of a member country could participate in that process. The second issue is to strengthen, really to create institutions in two areas: the debt restructuring issues, which we have none today, as well as to how to manage international tax cooperation, in which I think our basic recommendation is that the expert committee of the United Nations should be transformed into intergovernmental committee on international tax cooperation. It's a proposal that has been made twice, has been rejected two times, but I think we're going to go back because that's probably the best mechanism. Of course, the UN will have to collaborate with the OECD in the areas in which the OECD is also involved in international tax cooperation. And the third is the strengthening of regional institutions in all areas of financing. We only have a strong network of regional institutions in the case of multilateral development banks, but we don't have in international monetary cooperation, we don't have in international tax cooperation. So that the regional institutions are very important because the developing countries who are members, in a sense, feel that they own those institutions more than the multilateral institutions. So the access to those institutions and the capacity of the institutions to complement, but also compete with the global institutions is important, as we have seen in the case of development banks, so as to provide more possibilities of financing for developing countries. So in international monetary cooperation and international tax cooperation, we should have a system similar to that we have today in the case of multilateral development banks. That is a brief summary of some of the issues that we're working on.
Great, thank you for that comprehensive summary. And I'm now going to go to some of the members of the commission. First, who are joining us via video. First is Jiajun Xu. Jiajun, I don't know if you're there, from a professor at Peking University, and who we're so sorry you can't be here with us in person, but I'm hoping you're able to beam in.
Well, thank you very much, Sherry. Can you hear me?
Great, we can hear you and see you.
Excellent. So I'm very delighted to join the dialogue today, building the bridge between academia and practice in preparation for the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development. So my contribution today will focus on public development banks, which are financial institutions initiated and steered by government to fulfill public policy objectives. And the PDBs are potent instrument of transformative state capacity. According to the first global database on PDBs that I initiated to build in 2017, and then collaborated with AFD, FERDI, and other stakeholders to consolidate, there are over 500 PDBs from 150 economies, whose total asset adds up to 23 trillion USD. And to unleash the full potential of PDBs for achieving sustainable development goals, I would like to take this opportunity to propose 4 concrete steps. The first step is at the strategy level. PDB should take the lead in embracing the transformative, holistic, and comprehensive approach to financing SDGs as proposed by the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. The current international development financing system has fallen short of adopting such approach as it suffers from 3 main problems. First, it is inclined to opt for ready-made and often simplistic approach to complex structural challenges, which fail to foster structural transformation and build systematic capacities. And second, it tends to set up parallel and potentially fragmented thematic funds to tackle global challenges in a piecemeal and silo manner. And third, it is incentivized to achieve short-term performance targets, which fails to deliver sustainable impacts at scale. So to overcome the inertia of doing business as usual, PDB should rejuvenate the spirit of public entrepreneurship in pursuit of structural transformation in a sustainable, equitable, and resilient manner. If we look at history, it shows that public entrepreneurship has been crucial in achieving successful structural transformation in the US, Europe, Japan, China, and East Asian miracles. And it has 3 core features. Number 1, a comprehensive long-term vision. Number 2, acting on a very decisive scale and in an integrated manner, even in the presence of uncertainty and risk. And finally, it needs to have the creation of learning by doing feedback loop to enable bottom-up initiative to flourish and scale up. Today, the spirit of public entrepreneurship is much more needed than ever before, as achieving SDG requires structural transformation which has to be achieved within the planetary boundaries and resilient to external shocks in a globalized world. So this is my first proposal at the strategy level. And second, at the operational level, PDB should go beyond the current from billions to trillions agenda to advance transformational scaling. The mainstream from billion to trillion agenda has failed to foster public entrepreneurship for 3 reasons. First, it made its focus on the quantity of funding, defines scaling simply as more relatively to the baseline. And second, it has primarily taken a project approach, which does not address systematic barriers. And third, it mainly focuses on the output of one-off project achieved at completion. And to address these limitations, it is imperative to make a paradigm shift towards transformational scaling with 3 core elements. First, focus on long-term goals, recognizing the size of the problem and the potential pathways and roadmaps to achieve these long-term goals. And secondly, we need a planning framework that involves all stakeholders, including public and private actors, as well as civil societies, that design, implement, evaluate projects and programs as stepping stones to the long-term goals. And third, we have to address systematic barriers and align interventions with enabling conditions for sustainable impact at scale. So I think this is very important for us to unleash the potential, the transformative capacity of PDBs. And my next proposal focuses on the system level. PDB should work as one ecosystem to create synergies. To achieve transformational scaling, it's crucial to foster partnership across PDBs at multilateral, national, and subnational levels. I have to share with you 3 revealing findings from the first global database on PDB that I initiated to build. First, national development banks are the bulk of the PDB community. 2/3 of PDB are at the national level, accounting for 85% of the aggregate total asset. And second, subnational development banks are numerous but small. Although there are 120 subnational development banks, their asset only account for 5% of the aggregate volume. And thirdly, the top 30 PDBs are gigantic, accounting for 85% of the aggregate total asset. But a majority of PDBs, especially at the national and subnational level, are micro, small, and medium-sized ones. So to empower the small national and subnational development banks, it's crucial for MDBs and the large bilateral PDBs to step up their own lending effort, especially for those green transition projects that are small in size and dispersed nationwide. It is wise for MDB to tap into local branches and local knowledge of national and subnational ones to achieve the last mile outcomes. And for those green projects that cannot generate foreign reserves, it's also crucial for MDB to scale up local currency financing. And last but not least, at the level of international rules, it's crucial to put appropriate international financial regulatory framework in place to maintain the financial soundness of PDB while unleashing their transformative capacity as public entrepreneurs. Currently, in the absence of a tailored international financial regulatory framework for PDBs, national regulators tend to use Basel Accord as a default option to regulate national development banks. According to a survey done by my database team, 2/3 of sampled NDBs, national development banks, comply with Basel Accord, which is often regarded as the international best financial regulatory framework. And my research has found that blind compliance with Basel Accord would undermine the developmental role of PDB in providing large-scale, long-term, and high-risk capital that often go beyond the risk appetite of commercial banks. So to ensure the financial soundness of PDB while unleashing their transformative capacity, it's very important to vote a differentiated and tailored financial regulatory framework. So to summarize, I think the fourth International Conference on Financing for Development is once in a 10-year opportunity for the international community to take stock on the progress and challenges of financing SDGs and plan ahead to work better towards collective goals. It is a high time to address barriers at the strategy, operation, system, and rule levels to unleash the full potential of PDB for achieving SDGs. So to encourage more researchers to work together to advance this frontier research area on PDB, I have co-initiated the Global Research Network on PDB, which is formerly known as International Research Initiative of Development Finance Institutions, back in 2019 in collaboration with AFD and the CDB Academy, which has become the key research pillar of Finance in Common Summit. And we will hold the next research conference on February 26 to 28 next year in Cape Town. So we welcome more researchers across the globe to join hands to advance this research agenda to unleash the full potential of PDB for financing SDGs. Back to you, Sherry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thanks for those really concrete recommendations on PDBs. And it really mirrors a lot of some of the discussions that happened here today, particularly in terms of the public national development bank system, how the whole PDB system should work together as one. I'm now going to go to the next speaker also from the Commission, Professor Stephanie Griffith-Jones, but who's currently also Vice Governor of the Central Bank of Chile. Stephanie, you have been outspoken on the need for greening the financial system and scaling up financing for developing countries. What recommendations, including regulatory action, would you see as most impactful to unlock long-term sustainable and green investment, particularly in developing countries? So Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Harry. I'm delighted to be in this forum that you're chairing and this commission that Jose Antonio Campos is leading. As regards the need for clean investment in developing economies to reach net zero by net zero carbon emissions by 2050, the OECD has estimated in a recent study this year that this investment would need to be increased sevenfold by 2030 to a level of between 1.4 and 1.9 trillion dollars. And so therefore, there is an urgent need to mobilize massively sustainable finance for emerging economies and developing countries, which is both long-term and affordable. And for this, we require increased public and private finance, foreign and domestic capital, working together given the scale of the challenge. The public flows can also, as has been highlighted by Jajun, be channeled in an important part through development banks, multilateral, regional, and national, particularly, especially because they have this important advantage of leverage. In the case of private finance, an important instrument to use is financial regulation, for example, of commercial banks. A first step is to remove regulatory biases against the investment in low carbon assets, which is less favorable in the frequent case of the long maturities needed for such investment. In this case, the legitimate concerns of financial regulators to avoid excessive maturity mismatches for banks has to be compensated by the need to facilitate long-term finance for investment in low-carbon activities. Secondly, and more broadly, financial regulation, for example, of banks, should take account of the increased financial risk to banks of loans made to high-carbon activities, which also, of course, have important negative externalities for climate change and for biodiversity. For this purpose, financial regulators at a national and or regional level should require higher provisions and or higher capital requirements for loans to high carbon activities to take account both of physical risks such as floods or droughts, transition risks, which are changes of policies of government to ensure net zero carbon transition, as well as nature-related risks, which are linked to biodiversity risk. Such higher provisions or higher capital requirements would both discourage high carbon activities as well as encourage relatively low carbon ones, as the latter would have higher availability of finance as well as lower costs. I think it's very interesting that since 2022, that is already for 2 years, the European Central Bank has set clear deadlines for private banks to meet supervisory expectations to identify and better manage climate and environmental risk. And it's very interesting that by the end of 2024, all Eurozone banks are expected to meet all supervisory expectations of these risks, which includes a full integration into the capital adequacy assessment process, as well as stress testing. The ECB has reported that most banks in the Eurozone have actually met such integration, often with support from the regulatory authorities themselves, for example, who help with exchange of good practice. This has often led to Pillar 2 capital requirements for specific banks, so it's actually had a direct impact on the capital requirements that banks have to follow. And I think what is particularly interesting that the ECB, for those banks that have not achieved progress in their assessment of the impact of climate and environmental risks across their portfolios, the ECB has started to adopt enforcement measures which are quite stringent. By the end of this year, 2024, those banks that fail to meet these regulatory enforcement measures, the ECB may impose periodic penalty payments, which could be quite sizable, up to 5% of daily turnover for every day since infringement, up to a period of 6 months. This type of regulatory approach, I believe, discourages bank lending to high carbon activities, thus making banks less vulnerable to important climate and environmental risks, whilst indirectly encouraging more investment in low carbon activities. It is therefore very positive, the measures that are being taken by the European authorities, and it seems it would be very good if other countries and other regional authorities could consider adopting similar measures. Also, it would be very positive if international bodies such as the Basel Committee and or the Financial Stability Board could recommend such measures internationally. But however, it may actually be desirable to go further, whereby financial regulators could actually encourage directly private finance for low carbon activities. For example, by allowing lower provisions or lower capital requirements. This, however, would need to be done carefully in ways that do not add risks to financial stability, as crises are so costly. But measures like provision of partial national government guarantees and or co-financing by national, regional, and multilateral development banks to high priority, low carbon activities could reduce risks to financial stability, as well as helping to encourage and catalyze private flows. So I think this regulatory approach would be a very valuable complement to initiatives taken by the public initiatives, by public flows, and you could have a joint effort of increasing public flows, channeling them to in a sustainable way to green investment, as well as in parallel greening the private financial system. I think these are very desirable measures which actually could be taken not just for the reason of reducing climate change and loss of biodiversity risk, which is of course extremely important today, but also reducing financial risk of financial intermediaries and therefore reducing risk of future financial crises. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie, and for really pointing out that correctly taking and correctly valuing risks of some investments would actually have the dual effect of both reducing risk and creating greater investment and incentives for investment and lending to sustainable projects and green projects. I'm going to the final speaker from the Commission today, who's also joining via video, Professor Jayati Ghosh, who's Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And Jayati, I want to ask you to talk a little bit about debt. And you've been outspoken on the need to revamp the global debt architecture, and we'd love to hear your thoughts, and particularly your thoughts on issues related to domestic debt. So there's been a lot of discussion on debt issues today, and it would be great to hear your thoughts on this, and particularly with domestic debt. So Jayati, over to you.
Thank you so much, Shari. I know everyone must be really tired after a very long and intense day, so I'm going to try and keep this brief. Very quickly, I think it's obvious that the G20 Common Framework mechanisms haven't been working, and there are several reasons for this. They are very slow, they generate a stigma, and they basically have not really delivered for many of the debtor countries. So one obvious reason for this is because none of these negotiations involves a standstill on debt. And so clearly that must be an essential part of any debt restructuring framework, that there has to be a standstill, not a moratorium, which simply kicks the can down the road. But in terms of the way in which the debt sustainability analysis has been approached, I think there are really two big problems. And one of them is the way, what you have just identified, in terms of putting together the domestic debt and the debt in foreign exchange as one big lump that has to be reduced. So what the IMF does for market access countries is to say that it is the overall public debt which is a problem, and that has to be reduced, and that will generate the kinds of changes and adjustment that is required to deal with the debt. That is absolutely wrong. Because in fact, the high-income countries have got very high public debt to GDP ratios, in the excess of about 110% of GDP on average. Middle-income countries, it's only between 50 to 60% on average, and low-income countries only 40 to 45% on average. So already their public debt to GDP ratios are much lower, yet they are the ones facing debt crises. Why? Because it's the sovereign debt problem. It is really the inability to get foreign exchange. So what really has to happen is that you have to look at the capacity to earn foreign exchange or save it through import substituting measures. And so when the IMF says reduce your aggregate debt and that will resolve your debt problem, it doesn't, because it doesn't generate foreign exchange. Reducing public debt in the aggregate does not necessarily mean that you have more access to foreign exchange. So it's really that you have to consider the external debt as the problem, which is what it is, and think of the measures that would enable more access to foreign exchange. And the foreign exchange earnings are going to be the thing that actually generates the capacity to repay. So the important thing about the IMF's debt sustainability analysis is that it must stop clubbing together the domestic and foreign exchange debt. It really has to look at the issue of the foreign exchange debt and how to address it. We all know that the domestic debt can be handled much more easily by the government and the central banks, as happens in upper middle income countries and in the high income countries. But the second issue with the IMF's debt sustainability analysis, which I think is a real problem, is that it has the wrong macroeconomic model in terms of the government's response. It does not recognize that imposing what are effectively pro-cyclical policies in terms of fiscal contraction for consolidation worsens the growth and thereby worsens the capacity to repay. And this we've seen over and over again, and it is why so many of the DSAs turn out to be completely infructuous and unusable after the second or third year, and why new ones have to then be adjusted, because it's really forcing a wrong set of policies on the debt-constrained countries. Instead, while recognizing that, yes, some fiscal imbalances have to be corrected and fiscal consolidation is required, instead of focusing on more regressive taxation and user charges and on constraints on government spending, there really has to be a much more expanded and more relevant toolbox that includes wealth taxes, it includes digital service taxes along the lines that Jose Antonio has already mentioned, curbing illicit financial flows, and reducing regressive taxation generally. So there are issues with the way that the debt restructuring has been approached that link directly into some of the other measures that Jose Antonio already identified. So I just want to briefly mention those. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Jayati, and thanks for keeping it very succinct and really making your points quickly, because we have around 8 minutes for the rest of the session, and we have a little bit of time for questions and answers. So, or questions or thoughts. So please push your button and don't be shy. It's the end of the day. So all your thoughts that you've been thinking all day, it's time to make them. So please, yes, sir, go ahead. And if you can identify yourself first, thanks.
Hi everyone, my name is Pablo from Flaxo, Ecuador. I have a question for Professor Ocampo. What do you think about the relationship between political orientation with the type of lending of multilateral banks? Because some studies indicate that the policy-based loans are preferred by right governments and left governments prefer investment lending. Thank you very much.
Are there other questions or, oh yeah, please go ahead, yeah.
Today we organized this panel on local currency lending, and we have this paper that is ready that I recommend everybody to read that is interested in this topic. And a little bit the conclusion that I'm getting is that in a way, I'm talking about multilateral development banks on lending in local currency. And the problem there is very complicated to solve that. But in a way, there is like a trade-off. It's if you want to maximize the amount of lending that a multilateral development bank can do, then you should issue USD bonds and use the capital of the multilateral development bank to leverage. But that creates this currency mismatch and problems. So the solution that I came up with is that we should create these green local currency funds. That implies that the multilateral development banks are recapitalized and use that instead of leveraging to buy local currency and creating these local currency funds that will exist for all perpetuity. So in a sense, it's okay, if you want to leverage today, you can do it. But you can also say, well, I will not leverage that much, but I will create something that can continue a long time. So I wanted to know a little bit your thoughts on Jose Antonio. Well, also because you were the one that told me like a couple of years ago, many years ago, we need to understand this better. So now I am bringing more solutions here, and I want to know this trade-off. What do you feel? Do you feel it's better that multilateral development banks leverage more, but then there will be more currency risks, or that they leverage less, but more safely?
Great, thank you. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Hamilton Temp from Mozambique. I'm representing the Minister of Economy and Finance. I want to first express my gratitude for UN for this invitation that we had. Today, I had a lot. I learned a lot. But one of the reasons why I asked to talk is that I heard in the morning that education is the great weapon that we can have. If someone has a quality education, they can face any kind of issues in a wise way. So I will talk about what I know. What I know is my country. When we are talking about this global financing, when we go outside to advocate, to collect finances, most of the time we don't use those funds to really build the ground in the local level, to the ground, to the top. Most of the time, we see that the ones who protect the nature, the one who make sure that they can plant trees, and is the same people who really deal with the climate change when it comes. They deal with the floods, and they feel in these moments of mobilities, they have a lot of problems, even traumas, because they are not educated about the way how they can face this kind of issues. So my deepest ask to finish is to how does we can make sure that in this FFD4 we can grant it that the local level is the basic of development. How does we can make more investments directly to the local level? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Jose Antonio, I think we're going to go back to you now.
Let me perhaps answer on the political orientations. There should be no political orientations. All countries should be treated equally when lending by the multilateral development banks. This issue of local currency lending is a topic that we have discussed in the committee of experts, and in fact, one of the we go more or less in the same direction. We think that some of the lending by multilateral development banks should be in the local currencies of countries. in order to eliminate the currency mismatches. That is one of the basic problems of the over-indebted countries. Now, how to do that is of course an important issue. The best mechanism, in our view, is that there should be, in a sense, the multilateral development bank should be one of the promoters of the development of bond markets in the countries, in the local currencies, so that the World Bank in that case, or the Regional Development Bank, will issue bonds in the domestic currency of the country, and then use that money in order to lend to the country. That's the mechanism that we have that we're going to propose. Now, of course, that is closely associated to one of the issues that I mentioned in the beginning, which is when you are, by promoting the development financing at the local level, you have national development banks and also also the domestic bond markets, which is an important issue. Anyway, now the development of domestic bond markets, it takes time. Let's say it's not you don't create them instantaneously. It's a gradual process, but of course it's important, and to the extent that multilateral development banks contribute to the creation of domestic bond markets in the developing countries, I think they're making an interesting contribution to the development.
We have to close up, so maybe just say something about local level, and then let's.
Okay, on the local level, yes, the banks should invest not only lend to the national government but also to the local governments. I think that some of them are already doing that, and I think that could contribute. The basic issue in that regard, however, is the risk in which the bank incurs. So the question is, who is covering the national governments do have a risk level which is managed internationally, but local governments sometimes do not, and that's a major issue. So in many countries, what happens is that the national government becomes the guarantor of the lending to local governments, but it's not the most favorable process, let's say.
Thank you, Jose Antonio, and thank you so much to Jajun, Stephanie, and Jayati. And I'm sure you will continue to have these debates in the Commission, and we very much look forward to your report of the Commission as it comes, as you do your work. So thank you again for your really wonderful comments and for all of your work. And I'm now going to invite up the representatives from Mexico and Nepal, who are going to do the concluding session. So everybody stay. We're going to quickly change the podium and then do the concluding session as well. And I think I saw the representative from Mexico here as well. She's here.